The sound of my chainsaw cutting through the morning silence still echoes in my mind. As I watched that massive dock slowly drift away from the shore, carrying with it months of lies, betrayal, and stolen dreams, I knew there was no going back. My name is David, and what I'm about to tell you happened just 6 months ago on the lake that's been in my family for 3 generations. By the end of this story, you'll understand why I had no choice but to watch $5 million worth of someone else's dream house float helplessly toward the open sea. But first, let me take you back to where it all began, because what started as a simple property dispute became something so much darker than I ever imagined. 3 years ago, I inherited my grandfather's lake house in northern Michigan. It wasn't much to look at: a modest 2-bedroom cabin built in 1962, with weathered cedar siding and a dock that had seen better decades. But it sat on 43 acres of pristine lakefront property, with crystal clear water that stretched for miles in every direction. My grandfather had bought this land for almost nothing back when the area was considered too remote for development. Now, it was worth more than I'd ever dreamed. The lake itself was technically private, owned by a small group of families who'd purchased it collectively in the 1950s. There were only 7 properties around the entire shoreline, each with their own piece of paradise. We had a loose HOA, more of a gentleman's agreement really, to maintain the access road and handle basic upkeep. For decades, it had worked perfectly. We were all neighbors, all friends, all content with our quiet slice of heaven. That changed the day Margaret Thornfield moved in. She bought the Williamson property, the largest lot on the opposite shore from mine, in a cash deal that closed in less than 2 weeks. The previous owners, the Williamsons, had been there for 30 years and were like family to all of us. When they decided to retire to Florida, they mentioned they'd found a buyer, but none of us expected what came next. Margaret wasn't just wealthy, she was the kind of wealthy that changes places. Within a month of moving in, she demolished the charming 1960s ranch house and broken ground on what she called her dream retreat. The construction noise echoed across the water every day from dawn to dusk. Massive trucks rumbled down our narrow access road, which had never been designed for that kind of traffic. The pristine lake water grew murky from runoff, and the peaceful silence we'd all treasured was replaced by the constant sound of machinery. But Margaret wasn't content with just building her mansion. She had bigger plans for our little lake. The first HOA meeting she called was supposed to be about road maintenance. All 7 property owners gathered in the community lodge, a rustic building we'd used for decades for occasional get-togethers. Margaret arrived in a tailored business suit, carrying a leather portfolio thick with documents. The rest of us were in jeans and flannel shirts. "I think it's time we brought this community into the 21st century," she announced, not bothering with small talk. "I've had an attorney review our HOA agreement, and frankly, it's embarrassingly outdated." She slid copies of a new proposed agreement across the table. As I flipped through the pages, my blood ran cold. She wanted to restructure everything, create a formal board with herself as president, implement strict architectural guidelines, and most shocking of all, establish usage fees for lake access based on property improvement. "This is insane," said Tom Fletcher, who owned the cabin next to mine. "We've never needed any of this bureaucracy." Margaret's smile was ice cold. "Tom, I understand change is difficult, but we need proper governance if we want to protect our property values. Surely you can see that some of these older structures are bringing down the entire area's prestige." She was looking directly at my grandfather's cabin when she said it. The meeting dissolved into arguments. Most of us were firmly against her proposals, but Margaret had done her homework. She'd discovered that our original HOA agreement required only a simple majority vote to make changes, and she'd somehow convinced the Hendersons, the newest residents before her, to side with her. That gave her 3 votes out of 7. She only needed one more. "I'll be calling for a formal vote in 30 days, she announced as she packed up her documents. "I suggest you all use that time to really think about what's best for our community's future." As I walked back to my cabin that night, the lake looked different somehow. The moonlight still danced on the water, the same way it had when I was a child visiting my grandfather, but there was a shadow over everything now. I had no idea that Margaret's plans for our community were far more sinister than I'd imagined, and that she'd already begun putting the pieces in place to steal everything my family had built here. The real nightmare was just beginning. Over the next few weeks, Margaret launched what I can only describe as a charm offensive. She invited each property owner to tour her construction site, served expensive wine and catered lunches, and painted a picture of how wonderful our lake community could become with proper management. She was smart. She targeted the people she thought she could sway with precision. The Changs, who owned the smallest property and struggled with maintenance costs, were suddenly hearing about how shared community resources could save them money. The elderly Roberts couple was told about enhanced security measures and professional landscaping that would maintain their property values for their retirement. Margaret had a customized pitch for everyone. Meanwhile, my daily life became increasingly difficult. Suddenly, every small improvement I wanted to make to my property required community approval. When I tried to repair my grandfather's old dock, Margaret showed up with a clipboard and a measuring tape. "I'm sorry, David, but this structure appears to extend beyond your property line into common lake area," she said, scribbling notes. "Until we have proper surveys done, I'm afraid all waterfront construction needs to be halted." I'd been using that dock my entire life. My grandfather had built it with his own hands, and it had never bothered anyone. But Margaret had planted seeds of doubt, and suddenly other neighbors were questioning boundaries that had been respected for decades. The harassment escalated quickly. Margaret began documenting everything, photographing my property from the lake, measuring distances, filing complaints about noise when I used my lawnmower or started my boat engine. She'd somehow convinced the county to conduct routine inspections of older properties, citing safety concerns. The inspector who showed up at my door was apologetic but thorough. He found violations everywhere. My grandfather's electrical work wasn't up to current code. The septic system needed updating. The dock required permits that hadn't existed when it was built. The list of required improvements totaled nearly $60,000. "This is harassment," I told Tom Fletcher when he came over to commiserate. His property had been inspected the same week. "I know," he said, shaking his head. "But what can we do? She's got the county officials eating out of her hand, and now the Hendersons are completely on her side. If she gets one more vote, she can do whatever she wants with the HOA rules." That's when I learned about Margaret's masterstroke. I was having lunch at the diner in town when I overheard a conversation between 2 construction workers. They were talking about the big lake project they'd been hired for, and how the lady was paying double overtime to get it finished fast. "She wants the whole thing done before some vote happens," one of them said. "Dock, boathouse, guest cabin, the works. She's spending serious money to make sure it's all ready." I drove home with a sick feeling in my stomach. That evening, I grabbed my binoculars and took a closer look at Margaret's construction site from across the lake. What I saw made my blood boil. She wasn't just building a house, she was creating a private resort. The guest cabin was actually a massive secondary structure, positioned right on the waterline. The dock was enormous, big enough for multiple large boats, and it extended much farther into the lake than any of our existing docks. Most shocking of all, the entire complex was being built on what looked like reclaimed land. They'd actually extended her shoreline by dumping fill dirt into the lake itself. I called an emergency meeting with the other property owners who were still on my side. We met at Tom's cabin, away from Margaret's prying eyes. "She's violating everything," I said. spreading out photos I'd taken. "Look at this. She's literally stealing lake area to build her private paradise." Sarah Chang, Tom's wife, studied the pictures with a frown. "This doesn't look right. Isn't there some kind of environmental protection for the lake?" That's when I remembered something my grandfather had mentioned years ago, something about the lake being protected under a state conservation easement. The next morning, I drove to the county courthouse and began digging through decades of property records. What I found in those dusty files would change everything. But I was also about to discover that Margaret had secrets of her own, and she'd been planning this takeover far longer than any of us realized. The papers I uncovered would reveal a conspiracy that went back years, involving people I'd trusted and betrayals that cut deeper than I'd ever imagined. Would you have kept digging, knowing it might destroy relationships you'd valued for years? Because what I found next made me question everything I thought I knew about my neighbors and my family's legacy on this lake. The conservation easement document was buried in a filing cabinet from 1957, yellowed with age, but legally binding. According to the paperwork, when the original families purchased the lake, they'd agreed to maintain it as a natural habitat in perpetuity. No permanent structures could be built within 50 feet of the high water mark, and absolutely no filling or dredging could occur without state approval. Margaret's entire project was illegal. But as I made copies of the documents, a larger picture began to emerge. I started pulling property transfer records, looking for patterns, and what I found made my hands shake. Margaret hadn't just randomly decided to buy the Williamson property. She'd been circling our lake like a vulture for over 2 years, making quiet inquiries, researching property values, and most disturbing of all, she'd been in contact with certain residents long before she ever moved in. The paper trail was subtle but unmistakable. The Henderson property had been refinanced 6 months before Margaret arrived, with Henderson himself listed as a consultant on a company Margaret controlled. The Roberts couple had received a mysterious grant from an environmental foundation that turned out to be another of Margaret's shell companies. She hadn't been trying to win votes, she'd been buying them all along. I spent 3 days at the courthouse, following every lead, cross-referencing every document. By Friday afternoon, I had a stack of evidence that revealed the scope of Margaret's plan. She wasn't just trying to control our HOA, she was systematically acquiring influence over every property on the lake. Her ultimate goal was to force out the longtime residents and redevelop the entire area as an exclusive private resort. The properties that couldn't be bought would be harassed into selling through endless violations, fees, and legal battles. She'd already started the process with Tom and me, driving up our costs and making life unbearable until we'd have no choice but to sell to her at below market prices. But the most devastating discovery was still to come. As I was preparing to leave the courthouse, I decided to check one more set of records, the original lake purchase from 1954. I wanted to understand exactly how the conservation easement worked, and whether there were any other protections I could use to stop Margaret's illegal construction. What I found in that file made my entire world shift. The original purchaser of the lake hadn't been the group of families I'd always been told about. It had been one man, David Thornfield, Margaret's grandfather. He'd bought the entire lake as a single parcel, then immediately subdivided it and sold portions to selected families, keeping the largest section for himself. My grandfather hadn't been one of the original founders of our lake community. He'd been Margaret's grandfather's employee, a caretaker who'd been given a small lot as payment for decades of service. The humble story I'd grown up with about my grandfather being a pioneer who'd found this remote paradise was a lie. Margaret wasn't the outsider trying to destroy our family traditions. I was. The emotional blow was devastating, but it also clarified something crucial. Margaret's obsession with our lake wasn't just about money or control, it was personal. In her mind, She was reclaiming her family's legacy from people who had no right to be there. But as I sat in my car outside the courthouse, processing this revelation, I realized that the truth was more complicated than either of our family stories. Yes, my grandfather had started as an employee, but he'd earned his place on that lake through 40 years of faithful service. The Thornfield family had abandoned the property entirely for 2 generations, while my grandfather had maintained it, protected it, and loved it like his own. Legal ownership and moral right aren't always the same thing. More importantly, Margaret's illegal construction project was still illegal, regardless of her family history. The conservation easement was binding on all property owners, including her. And the evidence I'd gathered proved that she'd been manipulating our community through fraud and bribery for years. I had the power to stop her. The question was whether I had the courage to use it. That weekend, I made a decision that would change everything. I drove to Margaret's construction site and asked to speak with her privately. It was time for both of us to put our cards on the table. What happened in that conversation would determine whether our community survived and whether justice would finally be served for all the lies, manipulation, and betrayal that had brought us to this point. Margaret met me at her construction site on a gray Sunday morning. Her mansion was nearly complete, a soaring 3-story monument to wealth that dominated the shoreline like a fortress. The illegal dock stretched into the lake like a wooden highway, and construction equipment still cluttered the property. She was wearing work clothes, but somehow still managed to look like she'd stepped out of a magazine. "David," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "what brings you by?" I held up the folder of documents I'd copied at the courthouse. "I think we need to talk about conservation easements, shell companies, and family history." "I'm not sure what you mean." "I mean that your entire project violates the 1957 Conservation Agreement. I mean that you've been bribing my neighbors for votes. And I mean that we both know who really has the strongest claim to this lake." She studied me for a long moment, then gestured toward her house. "Why don't we go inside where we can talk privately?" The interior of her mansion was as impressive as the exterior, soaring ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake, furniture that probably cost more than most people's cars. She led me to a sitting area with a view of my grandfather's humble cabin across the water. "You've been busy," she said, settling into a leather chair. "I assume you found the property records." "All of them, including the original purchase by David Thornfield in 1954. Margaret nodded slowly. My grandfather was a complicated man. He had vision. He saw what this lake could become long before anyone else. But he also made promises he couldn't keep. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the water. "He hired your grandfather as a caretaker, yes. But he also promised him that lot as a permanent home. When my family lost interest in the lake and moved away, your grandfather stayed. He honored his commitment even when we didn't honor ours." I hadn't expected this admission. "Then why are you doing this? Why try to force us out?" Margaret turned back to me, and for the first time, I saw real emotion in her eyes. "Because I spent my entire childhood hearing about this magical place that my family had owned and lost. Because my grandfather died, believing he'd failed his vision for this lake. Because I made a promise to restore what should have been. By lying to our neighbors? By bribing them and manipulating county officials?" Her face hardened. "By doing whatever was necessary to reclaim what was rightfully ours." I opened my folder and spread the conservation easement documents on her coffee table. "This says otherwise. Your grandfather signed this agreement when he subdivided the property. No structures within 50 feet of the high water mark. No filling or dredging without state approval. Your entire dock and boathouse are illegal." Margaret barely glanced at the papers. "Those laws aren't enforced anymore. Times change. They're enforced when someone files a complaint with the State Environmental Agency, which I did yesterday morning. This time, her reaction was unmistakable. The color drained from her face as she realized what I was telling her. You wouldn't. This construction represents millions of dollars. You're right. 5.2 million, according to the permits I found, all of which will have to be torn down and removed from the lake. Margaret sank back into her chair, staring at the documents as if they might change if she looked hard enough. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. What do you want? I had thought about this moment during the entire drive over. Part of me wanted revenge for months of harassment and manipulation. Part of me wanted to see her lose everything the way she'd tried to make me lose everything. But sitting there in her beautiful house, looking at a woman whose family dreams had become an obsession, I realized that destruction wouldn't solve anything. I want you to stop the illegal construction and remove everything that violates the conservation easement. I want you to withdraw all the complaints and violations you filed against me and Tom. And I want you to release Henderson and Roberts from whatever financial arrangements you have with them. And in return? In return, you get to keep your house and become a legitimate member of our community. No more manipulation, no more power games. Just neighbors sharing a beautiful lake. Margaret was quiet for a long time, looking out at the water where both our grandfathers had once stood and made their own promises about this place. There's something else you should know, she said finally. Something I found in my grandfather's papers when I was planning this project. She walked to a desk and pulled out an old leather journal. He wrote about your grandfather in here. About what kind of man he was. She opened to a specific page and began reading. Frank is the best person I've ever hired. He doesn't just maintain this property, he loves it. He understands what makes this lake special in a way that I'm not sure my own family ever will. If something happens to me, I hope Frank will stay and protect this place. He's earned the right to call it home. My throat tightened as I listened to words my grandfather had never shared with anyone. Margaret closed the journal and looked at me directly. I've spent 2 years trying to reclaim my family's legacy, but maybe the real legacy was trusting people like your grandfather to preserve what matters most. The conversation that followed wasn't easy. There were lawyers to call, permits to cancel, and a community to face. But for the first time in months, I felt like the shadow hanging over our lake was beginning to lift. However, Margaret's story had one more twist that none of us saw coming. And the final resolution would require both of us to make sacrifices that would test whether our newfound understanding could survive the harsh reality of legal consequences and community justice. The state environmental inspector arrived on a Tuesday morning, accompanied by 2 assistants and enough official paperwork to sink a boat. Margaret met them at her dock, the illegal dock that stretched like an accusatory finger into the pristine lake water. I watched from my grandfather's cabin as they took measurements, photographed violations, and documented what would become a very expensive problem for Margaret. The conservation easement was crystal clear, and there was no arguing with 50 feet of illegal construction extending into protected waters. But Margaret had surprised me during our conversation the previous week. Instead of fighting the inevitable, she had already contacted her construction crew and ordered them to begin dismantling the illegal portions of her project. The massive dock was scheduled to be removed in sections over the following 2 weeks. That's when Tom Fletcher came up with what he called the most satisfying solution to a legal problem he'd ever seen. Why tear it apart? He asked when the 3 of us met to discuss the removal process. Why not just let nature reclaim it? Margaret looked confused, but I immediately understood what Tom was suggesting. The conservation easement required the removal of illegal structures from the lake. It didn't specify how they had to be removed. You want to set it adrift? Margaret asked. Tom grinned. I want to give it back to the lake. Let the current take it where it wants to go. The idea was both practical and poetic. Rather than spending weeks with heavy machinery tearing apart the dock and traumatizing the lake bottom, we could simply disconnect it from shore and let the natural current carry it away. The lake fed into a river system that eventually reached the Great Lakes, hence Tom's joke about it reaching the open sea. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, then surprised us both by laughing. My grandfather would have hated the waste, but I think he would have appreciated the symbolism. We spent the next week preparing for what became known in our community as the Great Dock Liberation. Margaret hired divers to ensure that disconnecting the structure wouldn't leave any debris in the lake bottom. Tom brought his boat to help guide the floating dock away from other properties. And I provided the chainsaw that would cut the final connections to shore. On the appointed morning, half the lake community gathered to witness what had become an oddly festive event. Even the Hendersons and Roberts showed up, freed from Margaret's financial arrangements and apparently relieved that the community war was finally ending. The sound of my chainsaw cutting through the support posts echoed across the water as morning mist rose from the lake surface. As the final connection was severed, the massive dock began to drift slowly away from Margaret's shoreline, riding the current like a wooden ship heading for open water. It was beautiful in a way I hadn't expected. The morning sun caught the water droplets falling from the floating structure, and for a moment it looked less like destruction and more like liberation, both for the lake and for all of us who had been trapped in months of conflict. Margaret stood at her legitimate shoreline, watching her illegal construction disappear around the far bend of the lake. She'd lost millions of dollars in materials and labor, but there was something peaceful in her expression that I hadn't seen before. "Do you regret it?" I asked her as the dock vanished from sight. She thought for a moment before answering. "I regret the lies and the manipulation. I regret trying to force something that needed to happen naturally. But I don't regret coming home." The cleanup took another month. Margaret's contractor removed the illegal boathouse and restored the filled shoreline to its natural state. The mansion remained. It had been built legally on her own property, but it no longer dominated the lake like a fortress. With the oversized dock gone, it looked more like what it should have been, a beautiful home instead of a statement of conquest. The HOA reforms Margaret had pushed for were quietly withdrawn. We returned to our informal system of shared responsibility and mutual respect, though with better communication and clearer boundaries than we'd had before. Tom Fletcher summed it up best at our first community barbecue that fall. Turns out we didn't need new rules. We just needed to remember the old ones about being good neighbors. Margaret brought homemade apple pie to that barbecue. It was delicious. 6 months later, I still think about that morning when I watched $5 million worth of dock drift away toward the horizon. It wasn't just about environmental violations or property rights. It was about understanding that some things can't be forced, bought, or manipulated into existence. Community, belonging, and home have to be earned through time, respect, and genuine care for the people and places around us. Margaret learned that lesson the expensive way, but she learned it. And in the end, our lake community became stronger because we all remembered what really mattered. The dock, according to local reports, made it about 30 miles downstream before breaking apart in a series of rapids. The pieces were eventually collected by environmental crews and properly recycled. In a way, it had returned to the forest where it began, just not in the way anyone had expected. Sometimes, the best solutions to our problems aren't the ones we plan. Sometimes, we just have to trust the current to carry us where we need to go. That's my story about the HOA president who built her dream house on stolen lake access, and how we let the water itself deliver justice. It wasn't the ending any of us expected, but it was the ending our community needed. Margaret still lives across the lake from me, and we've actually become friends of a sort. She understands now that belonging to a place isn't about ownership or control. It's about stewardship and respect for what came before us. And I've learned that sometimes the people who challenge us the most end up teaching us the most valuable lessons about ourselves. If you've dealt with your own HOA nightmares or neighbor disputes, I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this tale of lake justice and community healing, please subscribe to the channel. I have plenty more stories about the unexpected ways people find resolution when property lines blur and neighbor conflicts test everyone's limits. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's just letting go and watching the current carry away everything that shouldn't have been there in the first place.